So I have something a little bit different planned for this commentary before we get to episode 12, because by this point there were actually 2 Irat Gamer episodes that had been fully written and filmed, but for whatever reason were not completed and were eventually abandoned and never heard from again. The first one dates around early 2010, before the Doom episode. I wrote and filmed a full-length Haunted Investigators parody. It was structured a lot like an episode of The Haunted Investigators, where it introduced a location, which was, in this case, my garage. The Irat Gamer would go to the location, he would break in with special effects somehow, explore for paranormal activity, and then I did this kind of weird thing where he'd give up and then he'd find a PS2 and then it would just turn into a game review. Going over the script again for this episode, there are actually a couple decent lines, namely,
"If someone is here, can you please somehow let me know that you're here, by touching me anywhere you want to?" Definitely the most bizarre part of the investigation was when I tripped over a box on the ground, which I claim was placed there by a ghost.
The episode is, of course, also full of Irate Gamer references, though I think it's important to remember that references are not specifically jokes. And apart from the occasional funny line, the script just kind of plays like a regular Haunted Investigators episode. For example, there's like a whole backstory to why the garage is ostensibly haunted, something involving some spooky death, just like Haunted Investigators, but that's just like Haunted Investigators. And, you know, just like Haunted Investigators, it's not a joke. There's nothing funny about it. It's just, you know, a story. The only difference is I made it up. And maybe that's not even a difference between a parody and an episode of Haunted Investigators. I think at times the problem was it was just too close to its source material. Most of the good jokes written for this episode were recycled in the Hopeless Investigators section of episode 10, or otherwise sprinkled throughout later episodes. So you didn't really miss a lot without this episode, honestly. It's just interesting that I put so much effort into writing and filming something and just it never culminated in anything. So then later on, in early 2011, I started putting together an episode centered around Sonic 4, which had kind of just been released, not just, it was like a couple months ago. I didn't actually even remember making this episode until I went over the archival discs and found all the like little bits I'd filmed for it and the script for it. But I must have spent like a lot of time on it because I filmed it twice. Just like the last episode, as in the new Super Mario Brothers episode, I was trying to find alternatives to the Bruce voice, the trademark Irat Gamer voice. And just like the last episode, my very first attempt at such was to use my own voice. In this case, however, I wanted to start parodying Borz's new HD story arc, which had the whole, you know, evil gamer, shadow overlord thing. I've made a lot of references to that now, but I didn't think I had at the time. This required me to film myself, and god damn, is it terrible. I was pudgy, not particularly good at acting, and I'm wearing a Santa hat for some reason. There were some interesting ideas, I guess. Filming in front of a makeshift blue screen provided some interesting ideas, such as,
"Today, as you can see, I'm in front of my blue screen, which I can use to project exactly where I want to be right now. Isn't video editing software great?"
I was going to try parodying the whole going into the universe to find something thing, in the sense that the Irat Gamer couldn't find a Wii emulator, which I don't believe there was one back then, but there is now, a pretty decent one now.
"The first problem is that this game is harder than Osama bin Laden to find. You'll spend hours searching for Sonic 4 ROM, and you won't find a damn thing. You'll get so sick of the copyright infringement error. Yeah, like I even know what copyright means."
But for all intents and purposes, the blue screen worked, which is, if you've ever studied the evil shadow overlord graphic that I use and wondered, what is that shit on his head? It's a Santa hat, and this is where it came from. For some reason, I decided to use that footage, the pre-existing blue screen footage in the Castlemania episode, which was officially my first reference to the Shadow Overlord. And then, just because it existed, I decided to recreate the same asset for the Kingdom Hearts episode to look the same. And that's how we make the Irat Gamer have a consistent canonical storyline, yeah! Anyway, for reasons that seem both completely obvious and completely incomprehensible, I once again opted against using the version with my voice and ended up re-recording the entire episode with the whole neck below approach, which there were kind of a lot of shots to it. It wasn't a long episode, but there were a lot of shots to it, similar to the Kingdom Hearts one in a way. Even though I re-recorded it again, I gave up on completing this version as well. Honestly, like I said, it wasn't very long. The script's pretty short, especially compared to like the Halo 5 one. There wasn't a huge amount of substance to it, and like the Haunted Investigators parody, most of the good lines ended up being sprinkled through later episodes anyway. The episode would have been an interesting one to complete, but not a particularly worthwhile one. Once again, no one really missed anything without this episode. I just thought I'd mention these because, well, they're part of Irat gamer history technically, and this is a retrospective commentary, but also it demonstrates a few things about the Irat gamer at this point. They were progressively getting more and more ambitious, and I started experimenting with things where, it wasn't entirely clear if the end result would be good or not, if I'd like it or not. These were cases where they just weren't. It also represents something that I'd mentioned earlier, that I'd started getting a real sense of pride with the Irat gamer. Like, when I put effort into it, I'd be really proud of the result. And with the sense of pride came this kind of quality control, where I didn't just release anything I put together in a few hours like I used to. My commitment to making worthwhile entertainment was much stronger, and therefore I was, able to turn down videos if I thought they weren't very good. Sometimes, if you spend hours and hours of your life on something, there's a part of you that really wants to believe that you made something good, so you don't have to admit to yourself that you wasted a large chunk of your life on something shitty. But this was me kind of overcoming that feeling and being like, well, is it worth, spending more time to actually edit these together? Is it worth, wasting more time on, essentially? And I think that's really important when you're trying to do projects and stuff like this. I mean, nowadays I tend to look at this a lot more positively than, oh, I wasted all this time. I mean, you often learn and get just as much experience from a failed project as you do from a successful project. And you get a much, much clearer sense of what you did that had a good result and what you did that had a bad result. And you can use those kind of sensibilities in future projects. It's all kind of experience and developing your skills. So even though, it's tempting to think, oh, all this time was wasted and this is time that I could have spent on something good, I truly believe that in the sense of the Irat gamer, I had to do those episodes, that didn't get off the ground. I had to do those episodes to make the subsequent episodes. And even the earlier ones, even though, I'll say I'm pretty ashamed of them now, I had to do those to kind of do the episodes I do now. That's how just learning and how development works. And the fact that lines were lifted from these failed episodes and sprinkled through later episodes means that these projects definitely weren't wasted, at least not entirely. Anyway, so with that sentimental overload, thanks again to everyone who watches these commentaries, and I don't think I've really said this yet, but thanks to everyone who's stuck with the Irat gamer for all these years. This series has been, often extremely inconsistent and often fairly disrespectful to its fans, mostly due to negligence on my part. I mean, there was nearly an entire year without any content, which we'll get to, but I just want to say thanks so much, especially to people who have been around since the very beginning. I don't know how many people have been around since 2009, but even, 2011, that's still a good amount of time ago. When you consider that the Irat gamer has been a part of my life in varying degrees for nearly an entire third of my lifetime, you can kind of, I guess, hopefully see what kind of impact that these dumb parodies and the people that enjoy them have had on me. It's definitely been, an experience for me in some way or another. Wow, this has been an emotional episode. Stay tuned for the next commentaries as we delve into the Blue Room episodes.